Something just broke inside Iran that cannot be repaired. Not a missile, not a bomb, not an airstrike. Something far more dangerous than any of those things. Words, spoken inside Iran's own parliament, by Iran's own officials, admitting something that the regime has spent decades pretending was impossible. They admitted the war is lost, not hinted at it, not danced around it, not used diplomatic language to soften the blow. Lost. And when a government that has built its entire identity around resistance, defiance, and regional dominance, when that government stands up inside its own halls of power and says those words out loud, you are not watching politics anymore. You are watching the beginning of a collapse. But here is what makes this moment truly extraordinary. It is not just what was said. It is what was left unsaid. It is the silence that followed. The faces of officials who had no answer. The streets outside that parliament building where ordinary Iranians heard those words and began asking a question that no regime can survive once it starts spreading. What comes next? To understand why this moment is so seismic, you have to understand what Iran has been telling itself and telling the world for the last 40 years. Because the story of how a government reaches the point of admitting defeat in its own parliament is not a story that begins yesterday. It begins with a promise, a grand, sweeping, revolutionary promise. And it ends with that promise burning to the ground in real time. Iran's Islamic Republic was not just a government, it was a vision, a project, then a carefully constructed ideology built on one central idea. That Iran, through resistance, through its network of allies, through its missiles and its proxies and its revolutionary spirit, could reshape the Middle East, could push back against American influence, could encircle Israel, could become the dominant regional power. They called it the axis of resistance. And for decades, it worked, at least on the surface. Hezbollah in Lebanon became one of the most powerful non-state military forces on earth. The Houthis in Yemen transformed from a ragged insurgency into a force capable of striking Saudi Arabia and disrupting global shipping lanes. Hamas in Gaza ran an entire territory and built underground tunnel networks that baffled military planners around the world. Iraqi militias gave Iran effective control over large portions of Iraq's security apparatus. Syria, after years of devastating civil war, remained under Assad's control with Iranian boots on the ground, helping keep it that way. From Tehran's perspective, the map looked good. The project was working, but what most people don't realize is that every single one of those pieces was one catastrophic event away from unraveling. The axis of resistance was not a fortress. It was a house of cards, impressive from a distance, terrifying to its enemies, but internally fragile in ways that only became visible once the pressure became too great. And then the pressure became too great. It did not happen all at once. That is the thing about strategic collapse. It never does. It begins at the edges. A crack here, a fracture there. Individual pieces that seem manageable when isolated, but which tell a very different story when you step back and look at the full picture. The first crack appeared in Gaza. October 7th, 2023, changed everything in ways that even Hamas did not fully anticipate. The attack was devastating. The response was more devastating. And what followed was not just a military campaign, it was the systematic dismantling of Hamas as a functional governing and military force. Thousands of fighters killed, top commanders eliminated one by one. The tunnel network that had taken years and hundreds of millions of dollars to construct, destroyed. The political leadership scattered. And most critically, the narrative that Hamas represented an unstoppable force of resistance shattered. But here is where things take a serious turn. Gaza was not supposed to be the end of the story. From Iran's perspective, Gaza was supposed to trigger the full activation of the Axis. Hezbollah was supposed to open a massive northern front against Israel. The Houthis were already engaged. Iraqi militias were launching drones. The plan was for Israel to face simultaneous pressure from every direction. For the United States to be pulled into a conflict it could not manage. For the region to be set on fire in a way that forced a political solution favorable to the resistance. That plan failed. It failed not because the individual pieces didn't act, they did. The Houthis launched hundreds of missiles and drones. Iraqi militias struck American bases dozens of times. Hezbollah exchanged fire across the northern border for months. But the full-scale, coordinated, overwhelming activation of the Axis never happened. And the reason it never happened reveals something fundamental about the nature of the alliance Iran had spent decades building. The proxies were not suicidal. Each of them had their own calculations, their own populations, their own survival instincts. Hezbollah, the crown jewel of the Axis, watched what was happening in Gaza and made a cold, rational calculation. Full-scale war with Israel meant full-scale destruction of Lebanon. And Hezbollah's leadership, for all its revolutionary rhetoric, was not willing to trade Lebanon for Gaza. So the Northern Front stayed limited. And Iran watched its grand strategy stall in real time. Then came the blow that no one in Tehran was fully prepared for. Hezbollah's leadership was eliminated. Hassan Nasrallah, the man who had led Hezbollah for over 3 decades, the man who was arguably more influential than most heads of state in the region, the man who represented the living embodiment of the axis of resistance, was killed in a precise Israeli airstrike in Beirut. The silence that followed that announcement in Tehran was deafening. Nasrallah was not just a figure. He was the architecture. He was the trust. He was the decades of relationship building, operational coordination, and strategic alignment between Tehran and Beirut. Losing him was not like losing a commander. It was like losing the nervous system of the entire operation, and Israel did not stop there. What followed was one of the most audacious intelligence and military operations in modern history. Pager explosions detonated simultaneously across Lebanon, killing and maiming Hezbollah operatives who believed their communications were secure. Airstrike after airstrike, commander after command are safe house after safe house. The intelligence penetration of Hezbollah that these operations revealed was not a small breach. It was total, comprehensive, years in the making. Hezbollah was not just being hit, it was being dismantled from the inside out. And then Syria collapsed. This is where the story becomes almost impossible to fully absorb, because the speed and totality of what happened in Syria defied every prediction made by every analyst watching the region. Bashar al-Assad's government, which had survived a decade of brutal civil war, which had been propped up by Russian air power and Iranian ground forces and Hezbollah fighters, which had been written off a dozen times and come back each time, fell in a matter of days. Not weeks, days. The rebel offensive that swept through Aleppo and then south toward Damascus moved at a pace that shocked even those leading it. And the reason it moved that fast was directly connected to everything else happening in the region. Iran's forces were stretched. Hezbollah was bleeding. Russia was consumed by Ukraine. The pillars that had held Assad up simply were not there anymore in the same way they had been. When Damascus fell and Assad fled, something inside Tehran broke. Because Syria was not just an ally. Syria was the corridor, the physical land bridge connecting Iran to Hezbollah and Lebanon. Without Syria, the ability to move weapons, fighters, and resources directly to the Mediterranean coast, to Hezbollah's doorstep, was severed. The geography of the axis of resistance had fundamentally changed. But what happened next changed everything. Because even as Tehran was processing the loss of Syria, even as it was absorbing the near destruction of Hezbollah, even as it was watching Hamas's military capability be systematically dismantled, the pressure on Iran itself was growing. Israel struck Iran directly, twice. The first strike was in response to Iranian missile barrages. The second went further. Israeli aircraft reached targets inside Iran that demonstrated something deeply alarming to the regime's military planners. The air defenses that Iran had invested billions in, the systems meant to make Iran's skies impenetrable, had failed. Israeli jets had flown in, struck their targets, and flown out. The humiliation was profound, but the strategic implication was even more serious. If Israel could do this, what could the United States do? And here is where the internal conversations inside Iran began to shift in a direction the regime had never intended. Because the nuclear question, which had always been the ultimate card in Tehran's hand, the implied deterrent, the unspoken threat that kept maximum pressure from becoming something worse, that card was no longer playing the way it used to. The calculus had changed. And inside Iran's parliament, inside its security councils, inside, the conversations happening in rooms that were never meant to be public, officials were beginning to say out loud what they had privately feared for years. The strategy was not working. The axis of resistance, the project that had defined Iranian foreign policy for 4 decades, the project that had cost Iran hundreds of billions of dollars, that had placed it under crushing international sanctions, that had impoverished millions of Iranian citizens in service of a regional vision, that project was collapsing. And then someone said it inside parliament. The war is lost. Now, when those words land inside any parliament, the effects ripple outward in ways that are difficult to contain. But inside the Islamic Republic of Iran, those words carry a particular weight that you have to understand to fully appreciate the gravity of this moment. The Islamic Republic does not admit failure. It cannot. Because its legitimacy, the reason it gives its own people for why the economy is destroyed, why salaries are worthless, why sanctions have made basic goods unaffordable, why young Iranians are fleeing the country in record numbers, the reason for all of that suffering is the resistance. The cause, the project, the idea that Iran is enduring hardship in service of a historic struggle that it will ultimately win. If the war is lost, then what was the hardship for? That is the question that terrifies the regime more than any Israeli airstrike, more than any American sanction, more than any external threat, because external threats can be blamed on enemies, but internal questions, questions that the regime's own officials are now asking out loud inside its own parliament, those cannot be deflected so easily. The Iranian street has been watching all of this unfold, and the Iranian street has a memory. It remembers 2019 when fuel prices spiked overnight and protests erupted across dozens of cities, and the government responded by shutting down the internet and opening fire on crowds. Hundreds killed, thousands arrested. The regime held, but the scars remained. It remembers 2022 when Mahsa Amini died in the custody of the morality police and the streets of Iran erupted in the most sustained and widespread uprising the Islamic Republic had ever faced. Women removing their hijabs, crowds chanting not just against specific policies, but against the system itself, against the supreme leader himself. That movement was crushed, but it was not erased. The people who took to those streets are still there, older by a few years, angrier by a considerable degree, and now watching their government stand up inside Parliament and admit that the grand project, the one that justified all the sacrifice and all the suffering, has failed. What most people don't realize is that economic collapse and ideological collapse almost never happen in sequence. They happen simultaneously. They feed each other. The economy feeds the ideology, and the ideology feeds the economy. And when both start to unravel at the same time, the process accelerates in ways that are very difficult for any government to manage. Iran's economy is in serious trouble. The rial has lost a staggering percentage of its value over the past decade. Inflation has made everyday life genuinely difficult for ordinary Iranians. Unemployment, particularly among young people, is high. Brain drain, the exodus of educated, skilled Iranians to other countries, has been accelerating for years. The people most capable of building Iran's future are leaving Iran. And the sanctions, which might have been manageable if the regional strategy was producing results, feel very different now that the regional strategy is visibly failing. Why are we suffering for a war that has been lost? That question is spreading. Inside Iran, inside the political establishment, inside the military, inside the Revolutionary Guards, which has its own internal tensions between those who believe the ideology requires them to keep fighting regardless of cost, and those who are beginning to do the cold arithmetic of survival. The Revolutionary Guards, the IRGC, deserves particular attention at this moment because they are the institution that sits at the absolute center of this crisis. The IRGC is not just a military force, it is an economic empire. It controls enormous sectors of Iran's economy. It runs businesses, manages ports, oversees construction projects. Its senior leadership has accumulated extraordinary wealth in a country where ordinary citizens struggle to afford basic necessities. For those senior leaders, ideology and self-interest have always been aligned. Supporting the regime meant protecting their economic position. Resistance meant continued IRGC dominance. But what happens when the resistance starts to fail? What happens when the assets built over decades, the proxy network, the regional influence, the strategic deterrence, begin to crumble? Does ideology hold, or does self-preservation start to win the calculation? These are the questions that intelligence services around the world are asking right now, and they don't have clean answers. Because the IRGC is not monolithic. It never was. And the cracks that are appearing in the broader Iranian system are also appearing quietly inside the guards themselves. Meanwhile, the international dimension of this crisis is shifting in ways that add further pressure to Tehran. Russia, which had been a reliable partner in keeping Iran's regional projects alive, particularly in Syria, is mired in Ukraine. The relationship between Moscow and Tehran has not collapsed, but it has been severely strained by the fall of Assad and by Russia's failure to prevent it. Putin had promised Assad that Russia would not let Damascus fall. Damascus fell. That failure carries consequences for Russia's credibility as a patron across the entire region. China, which has its own strategic relationship with Iran as part of its broader push to expand influence in the Middle East, is watching carefully. Beijing does not want chaos on the Iranian side of the Gulf. Chinese tankers and trade routes depend on a degree of stability. But China is also calibrating, hedging, making sure that whatever comes next in Iran, China maintains relationships on multiple sides. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia and the UAE in particular, had spent years managing their fear of Iranian power. They had hedged, negotiated, and in some cases quietly accommodated Iranian influence because the alternative seemed too dangerous. But the regional picture looks very different now. The Abraham Accords had already begun, reshaping alliances. Saudi Arabia's own normalization process with Israel, though complicated, had been proceeding. And now, watching Iran's strategic position erode, the Gulf states are recalculating. A weakened Iran is a different proposition than a powerful Iran, and the way you deal with a weakened Iran is very different from the way you deal with one at the height of its regional influence. The United States is also in the middle of its own calculations. The Trump administration, returned to power, has taken an approach to the Middle East that is significantly more pressure-oriented toward Iran than the previous administration. Maximum pressure, the economic strategy designed to force Iran to make concessions on its nuclear program and regional behavior, is back with full force. The timing matters here. because maximum pressure works very differently when it arrives, as the target is already internally stressed. When an economy is already broken and a grand strategy is already failing, additional external pressure does not simply add to existing problems. It multiplies them, it accelerates timelines, it forces decisions that might otherwise be delayed for years into months or even weeks. And there is the nuclear question sitting at the center of all of it. Iran's nuclear program has always been the ultimate hedge, the insurance policy, the thing that was never explicitly admitted but was always implicitly understood. If everything else fails, if the proxies fall and the economy collapses and the people revolt, the nuclear deterrent, or even the credible threat of one, changes the calculation for any adversary considering finishing the job. But here is the brutal logic that Iran's own parliament is now being forced to confront. The nuclear program, for all the years and all the investment and all the sanctions endured to protect it, has not provided deterrence. Israel struck Iran twice. The nuclear threshold was not crossed, but the strikes happened. And if conventional deterrence has failed, if the air defense has failed, if the proxies have been degraded, if the economy is collapsing and the population is restless, what exactly is the nuclear program protecting? Or to put it another way, is the nuclear program the last card in a losing hand? Or is it the one thing that, if played now, changes the game entirely? That is the most dangerous question in the world right now, and it is being asked inside Iran at this exact moment. Because some voices in Tehran see the degradation of the axis of resistance not as a reason to de-escalate, not as a reason to accept a deal, not as a reason to pull back and recalibrate, but as a reason to accelerate toward the one capability that would make any further attack on Iran unthinkable. And other voices see exactly where that path leads. A nuclear Iran does not deter Israel. It triggers Israel. It triggers the United States. It triggers a military response that the current Iranian state, with its degraded defenses and its stretched military and its restless population, may not survive. So the argument inside Iran right now is not really about nuclear weapons versus diplomacy. It is about survival, about what kind of Iran exists in 10 years, about whether the Islamic Republic as a system can survive the collapse of the ideology that justified it, about whether a leadership class that has built its entire identity around resistance can pivot to something else without losing everything. And it is that argument, that raw existential argument about survival, that spilled out of the closed rooms and into the parliament. The war is lost. 3 words that contain within them the entire weight of 40 years of Iranian revolutionary foreign policy. The lives lost, the money spent, the sanctions endured, the isolation accepted, the people who left, the people who stayed and suffered. All of it compressed into 3 words spoken aloud in the one place they were never supposed to be spoken. Now ask yourself this. When a government's own parliament begins speaking that kind of truth out loud, what usually comes next? History has an answer. And that answer is not comfortable. Sometimes what comes next is reform. A genuine reckoning, a decision by the system to change course, to negotiate, to find a new path that preserves the state, even if it abandons the ideology. Iran has done this before in limited ways. The nuclear deal under Rouhani was a version of this. A decision by the system that the costs had become too high and that a negotiated pause was better than continued confrontation. But those negotiations happened from a position of relative strength. Iran had a functioning proxy network. Its economy, while damaged, was recoverable. The axis of resistance was intact. The leverage was real. The negotiations that would happen now would be different. They would happen with a degraded proxy network, with an economy in genuine crisis, with a population that has already demonstrated its willingness to take to the streets, with an internal establishment that is visibly fracturing, with Israel having demonstrated that it can strike inside Iran at will. That is not a negotiation. That is a capitulation dressed in diplomatic language. And the regime knows it, which is why the option of negotiating from this position is not one that the hardliners inside the IRGC will accept easily, because accepting it means accepting the defeat that has already been publicly acknowledged. It means giving up everything the system was built on. And for the people who have built their entire identities, their entire careers, their entire sense of meaning around the resistance, that is not a political defeat. That is an existential one. So instead of reform, sometimes what comes next after a parliament admits defeat is escalation. A desperate, dangerous move designed to change the narrative, to create a crisis large enough to rally people around the flag, to make the external threat so visible and so immediate that internal questions get swallowed by external fear. This is perhaps the most dangerous possibility right now, not because it would work, but because history is full of governments that chose it anyway. Not because it was rational, but because it was the only option that didn't require them to admit to themselves what they had already admitted to their parliament, that the war is lost. There is a third possibility, And it is the one that analysts in Washington and Tel Aviv and Riyadh are watching for most carefully right now. Internal rupture. Not a revolution in the streets, though that remains possible, but a fracturing of the establishment itself. A split between the pragmatists and the hardliners, between those who want to save the state by abandoning the ideology and those who would rather take everything down than accept that outcome. Iran has never had a clean leadership transition. The Islamic Republic was built around the concept of the supreme leader, the single figure whose authority, drawn from religious and revolutionary legitimacy, stands above all others. That structure was designed to prevent exactly the kind of internal fracturing that now seems possible. But structures designed to prevent things do not always succeed, especially when the foundation they rest on begins to crack. Khamenei is old. He has been in power for over 3 decades. The question of succession has always been sensitive inside Iran, but it becomes vastly more complicated when the system he is handing over is one invisible crisis, when the ideology he built his rule around is being publicly questioned inside his own parliament, when the regional project that was supposed to be his legacy is being described as lost. Who inherits this? And on what terms? And with what mandate? These are questions that do not have answers yet, but they are questions that will have answers. And the direction those answers go will determine not just what kind of Iran exists on the other side of this crisis, but what the entire Middle East looks like in the years ahead. Because make no mistake about what this moment represents. This is not a temporary setback. This is not a tactical reversal that can be corrected with time and resources. The admission inside Iran's parliament that the war is lost is the beginning of a fundamental reckoning with 40 years of strategic choices. And reckonings of that magnitude do not resolve quietly or quickly. They reshape the order of entire regions. They create vacuums that other powers rush to fill. They produce new alignments and new conflicts. They force every government in the region to recalculate everything they thought they understood about the balance of power, about who is strong and who is weak, about what the next decade is going to look like. The Houthis in Yemen are watching Tehran closely right now. So are the remaining Iraqi militias. So are whatever is left of Hamas's political leadership in Qatar and Turkey. All of them built their strategies on the assumption that Iran would be there, that the backing would continue, that the resources would flow, that the strategic direction would hold. What happens to each of them if it doesn't? What happens to Lebanon, which has been devastated by the conflict, whose economy was already destroyed before the latest round of fighting, whose political system has been paralyzed for years by Hezbollah's dominance? What does Lebanon look like in a world where that dominance has been broken? What happens to Iraq, whose government has been trying to balance between American and Iranian influence for 2 decades, when that balance suddenly shifts? What happens to Israel, which has achieved extraordinary tactical success over the past year, but which now faces the complicated question of what success actually looks like in a region being fundamentally restructured? What happens to the United States, whose maximum pressure strategy is producing results, but whose understanding of what comes after Iran's decline is not clearly articulated? And most importantly, what happens to the Iranian people? The 88 million human beings who have lived through sanctions and isolation and revolution and war, and have endured extraordinary hardship in service of a project that their own government is now admitting has failed? Their aspirations have not changed. They want what people everywhere want: economic security, personal freedom, a government that serves them rather than using them as instruments of an ideological vision that cost them everything and delivered nothing. Whether the end of the axis of resistance leads to something better for those 88 million people, or whether it leads to something worse, depends on choices that have not yet been made by leaders inside Iran, by regional powers, by the United States, by the international community. But what is no longer in question, what the admission inside Iran's parliament has made impossible to pretend otherwise about, is that the old order is over. The war is lost, and what comes after a lost war is never simply peace. It is a contest over who shapes what replaces it. And that contest is beginning right now, in the streets of Tehran, in the corridors of the parliament that spoke the unspeakable, in the military councils of a Revolutionary Guard Corps trying to figure out what it defends when the revolution's project is gone, in the calculations of every regional power watching the center of the axis of resistance begin to come apart. The world is not watching a defeated country fade quietly from the stage. It is watching something far more unpredictable. It is watching a 40-year-old system, built on ideology and sacrifice and resistance, confront for the first time in a public and irreversible way the possibility that everything it was built for was not enough. That is not a political event. That is a historical one, and we are living through it in real time. The question is not whether Iran changes from here. It will. The question is how, and whether the people who have suffered longest and sacrificed most, the Iranian people themselves, finally get a say in what that change looks like. That answer is still being written, and where it ends, Nobody, not in Tehran, not in Washington, not in Tel Aviv, not anywhere, knows yet. What they do know is this. 3 words spoken inside a parliament that was never supposed to say them have already changed the shape of what comes next. The war is lost. Now comes the reckoning.